we start off the discussion with Professor Hudson talking about what the upcoming G20 meeting is all about. It's coming up in Toronto this week.
It's been orchestrated for the last half year, starting with President Obama's appointment of a commission to balance the budget. The head of the European Central Bank, Claude Trichet, has already said what the theme will be, that the only way to get prosperous is to being poor. He's telling countries you have to be poorer, you have to cut your wage rates. Latvia is looked at as the ideal that's being recommended for Greece and other countries in budget deficit. Latvia has cut its public sector wages by 30%. And we were told a few weeks ago by the head of the central bank there's only a little bit more to cut to get to the 40% rate. So the theme of the meeting in Ottawa will be that it's time for governments to bring on a artificial depression. The aim is to lower wage rates throughout the world by about 40%. In other words, the game is over, the bubble's over, it's time for the foreclosures now. And there have been a number of sort of truisms that they're going to try to popularize throughout the world. They're basically oxymorons. The main one is prosperity requires austerity. In other words, the whole world is going to be suffering from the kind of austerity plan that the International Monetary Fund has been pushing on third world countries. Cut back social spending, run a budget surplus, not a deficit, as Latvia has done, shrink the economy, draw the money out of the economy, collapse wages, cut back Social Security, cut back pensions, cut back social spending, cut back educational spending, and in essence roll the time clock back about a century to what it was like not only before the New Deal in the United States, but before the whole progressive era that was flowering before World War I. There are going to be a number of things that are said in Ottawa that are absolutely the opposite of reality. One is that an independent central bank is the hallmark of democracy. Actually, an independent central bank is the hallmark of oligarchy. Now that planning is being centralized in the hands of the central bankers, which are the lobbyists for the commercial bankers, you have planning passing out of the hands of elected government people into the hands of unelected bankers. And the problem is that the financial time frame for planning is very short term. It's hit and run. It's make a quick hit, leave the customer with holding an empty bag, and when a banker sees a customer come in, the first thought is, how much does the person have, and how can we get it out of his pocket into ours? This is the kind of planning that the world is going to have for the next few years. And another mythology people are told is that the reason that governments have to balance their budget is governments are just like families. They have to balance the budget and not run into debt. What they don't realize is that central banks were formed precisely to fund the government debt. For the last half century, economic students all over the world have been told that when an economy is going into a recession, when there's a collapse of the world economies, governments have to run a budget deficit in order to supply the purchasing power, supply the liquidity to keep the governments going. But right now, even though there's a recession, or the Great Depression number 2, governments are being told, don't support wages, don't support spending, don't slow the decline, accelerate the decline by sucking even more money out of the economy.
During the Great Depression times, there were similar pushes, weren't there, for public spending to be wound right back at the very beginning of the Great Depression. Why aren't we learning anything from this?
Because the lessons that normally would be taught are excluded from the economics curriculum. Essentially, what calls itself free market economics is pro-financial economics. It's economics subsidized by the financial sector. And in the United States, that's called the Chicago School. In other countries, it's called monetarism or simply neoliberalism now. And what the neoliberal free marketers realize is that in order to have what they call a free market, you have to have a totalitarian control of government, control of media and control of the educational system. If you don't have total control of the educational system to exclude the economic history of the 1930s, to exclude classical economics, to keep out any idea but your own, then people are going to adopt these better ideas and not yours. So you've had the economics profession stripped of everything that people used to learn when I went to graduate school to get my degree 50 years ago.
And so this battleground that's continually drawn around scarcity and scarcity rents. Just in the last few hours, Belarus and Russia are having another stoush over their pipeline access rights for gas and the price Russia charges in return for that gas to Belarus. How can societies, neighbouring communities, live together in sharing these scarcity rents?
You usually have international relations as power relations. The problem with Belarus and Russia was that Belarus used to be the very heart of Russia. Minsk, for instance, is in Belarus. Just like the Ukraine used to be the original Russia area. Now, the United States neoliberals came in the 1990 and convinced Yeltsin to break up the Soviet Union. So now they're different countries. And now Russia is saying, well, why we're a government that's supporting Russians. Why should we give you the free lunch from the fact that we're lucky enough to be sitting on a huge gas reserve? You're going to have to pay the world price like any other nation, unless you decide you want to be part of Russia. And in that case, you get gas at the same price that we get in our nation. If you're going to be a different nation, you have to pay what all the other countries have to pay. You're either with us or you're not.
As we're at this point of peak everything, peak oil and companies having to drill in deeper and deeper water spaces, we've got Belarus and Russia competing. There, in Australia, there's a huge mining tax debate going on over how much of the share of the Commonwealth the people should get versus the billionaires. Amazing scenes, Michael. You wouldn't believe these protests with billionaires out in the streets. It seems that the future of economics is going to see more and more focus on the easy profits that resources and their scarcity deliver. What are you foreseeing in this current environment where so many economists have been dumbed down and have not been taught these essential principles?
I think the key isn't really resources today so much as finance. The attempt is going to be to grab resources, not militarily, as was done in the past, but financially. So the new form of international attack, exploitation, and extraction of tribute is going to be done financially, not militarily, and the financially oriented power grab is politicizing itself very much through the Group of 20 that's meeting in Canada, through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, through what here is called the Washington Consensus, the idea that the rest of the world exists to supply all of its surplus to the United States. And as long as other countries, from England to Australia to Europe, believe that their role is to turn over their surplus to the United States, and specifically to bankers in the United States, you're going to have that overwhelm the whole issue of natural resources.
But surely people such as the Chinese and the radicals in Iceland and places like that, they're not going to believe that. They're going to think that if they own resources, they can earn good hard cash from that, and that gives them a competitive advantage where they have their own income streams and they don't so much need the banking sector. I would have thought that resources are still a very important role in this ever-expanding economy we live within.
What you're saying was what everybody believed a century ago, and it seems a natural way of doing things. There's nothing natural about finance being more important than resources. You'd think that the whole world is constrained by who has the land, who has the natural resources. You think that it would be crazy, indeed, for Iceland to give away all of its power without getting really any tax revenues to the aluminum companies that are refining aluminum there. And if you thought that, you'd be wrong, because they do give away everything for nothing. The fact is that the primary premise that's taught in every economics book and every political science book is wrong. And that premise is nations act in their own self-interest or the interest of their people under democracy. And number two, that in a democracy, voters are going to vote for their self-interest. Now, if voters really voted for self-interest and elected officials that acted in the national interest to help the voters, then the world would not be the way it is. So the question is, how did the world get this way, where countries and populations are not voting their self-interest, where they seem to be voting for the interest of other countries and for bankers, and for a kind of a economic dynamic that's exactly the opposite that they believe in. Most people believe the world should be more equal, as you're indicating. Most people say that everyone should have the same opportunity. But the society we're in is just the opposite, where society is getting more and more unequal, where wealth is polarizing between creditors and debtors, and between creditor countries and debtor countries. And how can you possibly explain all of this? This should be what economics really is all about. How to explain why the world is diverging from what you'd think it's supposed to be. And yet there's that topic doesn't even come up in economic studies.
You've just visited Eastern Europe and Latvia in particular, and over the last 24 hours it's broken that Iceland is announcing a safe zone, a safe haven for whistleblowers and in particular for journalists there. It seems like Eastern Europe is becoming more radicalized. Are the people waking up?
No. Iceland is called the most Soviet of all of the Western economies, but that's because it's so bureaucratic and centralized and kleptocratic. And there's a feeling of floundering in Iceland. The reason that WikiLeaks is sponsored in Iceland is because the whole country let itself essentially be robbed by a small group of kleptocrats working with old Soviet Russian kleptocrats. And they wanted to expose all of the loans and the banking frauds that bankrupted the country. So there's a reason for that, and quite apart from its Scandinavian origins. But in Eastern Europe, that's quite a different situation. The people are not voting for their self-interest there. All of the governments of the Baltics and the other Central European economies are the most unequal of all in Europe. And they're unequal because the neoliberals who are running these economies keep saying they give them a false choice. They say your choice is either to go back to the Soviet era and subordination to Russia, or the West. And, of course, the West that they're told about isn't the kind of West that they expected, Western prosperity, social democracy, labor parties. It's becoming a colony of Western Europe, a banking colony, a real estate colony, a financial colony, and a market for surplus agricultural crop surpluses and other goods. So the Eastern Europeans are being given a choice: either go back to Russia and be exploited Soviet style, or join Europe and be exploited Western style. And the populations keep remembering how awful it was under Russian Soviet domination, and they'll choose anything except that, and they're not being given another choice.
Is there any hope for the Latvians? I've heard from you that the main opposition party in Latvia is thinking about some radical economic reform.
Yes, the current neoliberal government in power there says that the way to become more competitive and prosperous in Latvia is to be poor. They cut wages by 40% on the theory that if you cut wages and the cost of labor, you'll be more competitive. Now, in one sense, this is true, but in Latvia, you have the most unequal tax system in the entire world. You have taxes on labor, on wage labor, of over 50%, and you have taxes on property of 0.1%. It's gone up to 1% in some cases, but you have almost no tax on real estate and on land, and an enormous tax on labor. What we're suggesting, a group of experts that came, including two Australians, Terry and Debbie Dwyer, Australian lawyers, we worked out a plan saying, look, you can cut the cost of Latvian labor to its employers by 50%. You can cut it in half without reducing living standards. And you can do that by shifting the taxes off labor, off this terrible flat tax on labor of over 50%,